I'm now going to introduce our first speaker, who is Yang The Deprogrammer. It's completely fantastic. Just a total honor that you're coming to speak to us. Yang's a former trans rights activist and LGBT non-profit whistleblower. She's going to share her original research exposing the United Nations worldwide agenda to erase sex-based rights. So she's going to use official documents and propaganda issued by the United Nations, demonstrate how the UN Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as the 2030 Agenda, outline a plan for worldwide female erasure. And it will end with a brief report back from the first ever women's demonstration against the UN's coordinated erasure of sex-specific language. So it's just a great honor. If you haven't seen Yang in other videos, I absolutely recommend. This is not going to be long enough to really hear everything or even part of what she has to offer. She's absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much, Kay, and over to you.
A short disclaimer: if you are so compelled and you have the means to do so, here is a list of ways to support my work. So I'm a completely independent artist, writer, filmmaker, activist, organizer, and research. My work and my views represent only myself. I'm not on the payroll of any nonprofit or commercial business, nor have I been paid or commissioned by any private interests to do this work. I'm drawing upon my personal experience as an organizer and activist of over 20 years and utilizing skill sets I have developed to uncover a hidden in plain sight worldwide gender identity agenda being constructed at the expense of the female sex class and child safeguarding and our sex-based reality. Okay, the League of Nations is said to be the predecessor of the UN. It was formed at the Paris Conference after World War II in 1929 and officially began in October of 1945 when it was ratified in San Francisco, USA. By April 20th, 1946, the League of Nations had ceased operations. China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US are original signatories who ratified the charter, bringing the UN into existence, and those 5 sovereign states have been granted a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Here's a look at a map depicting the level of global reach the UN had when it began in 1945 with 51 members. In contrast, a quick look at the UN's reach today. They have over 193 member nation states. In 1946, the Commission on the Status of Women and Girls was established. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed by the UN General Assembly in Paris on the 10th of December and described by its creators as a common standard of achievements for all peoples and all nations. The first Convention on Political Rights of Women was held in New York City in March of 1953. The first World Conference on Women held in 1975 focused solely on women's issues and was held in Mexico City. 1975 was named the UN Year of the Women, and the decade to follow was named the UN Decade for Women. A report was issued from the First World Conference of the International Women's Year. The report stated a specific purpose of eliminating discrimination on the ground of sex and promoting equal rights of men and women, and condemned, quote, sex discrimination as fundamentally unjust. In 1979, a treaty called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women was internationally adopted and formally signed in 1980 by the UN General Assembly. In 1987, Our Common Future, also known as the Brundtland Report, was published in October by the UN in 1987. In it, the term sustainable development was first defined as, quote, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The Rio Earth Summit was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992, where sustainable development terminology first began to take root. The agenda for the 21st century, aka Agenda 21, was an outcome of the summit and is described as a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the UN system, governments, and major groups in every area in which human impacts on the environment. In September 1995, the year of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, the Fourth World Conference on Women was produced the Beijing Declaration. The Beijing Declaration does not mention sex except for within the term sexual health. The declaration mentions the following gender-related terms, quote, gender sensitive, gender equality, and gender perspectives. The Millennium Development Goals were 8 international development goals for the year 2015 that have been established following the Millennium Summit of the UN in 2000 at the UN headquarters in New York City. The purpose of the MDGs was to discuss the role of the UN at the turn of the 21st century. The terms gender equality, gender issues, and sex each make one singular appearance in the UN Millennium Declaration. Notice here, maternal health and gender equality are separate goals within the MDGs, indicating the uncoupling of biological sex from gender and the term woman. Jennifer Billick of the 11th Hour blog has done extensive work exposing the money behind the Arcus Foundation, tracing it through multi-billionaire heir John Stryker to the Fortune 500 Medical Technology Corporation Stryker, founded by John's grandfather, Homer Stryker. Writing for Gender Dissent, Felicia Rembrandt traced nearly 900,000 of Arcus grant money, some of which was funneled through the Tides Foundation to ARC International. ARC website describes 2009 to 2010 as, quote, a pivotal period as we moved into the implementation phase of the UN human rights reform process and work with NGOs to address the implications of these reforms for LGBT equality rights, build global support for the Yogyakarta principles, and develop a coordinated strategic vision for advancing these issues throughout the years ahead, end quote. ARC International is a Canadian-based propaganda and lobbying firm whose public records show their first donations received from John Stryker's Arcus Foundation financed the propagation of the Yogyakarta principles. The Yogyakarta principles were developed and unanimously adopted in 2006 in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, by a group of so-called human rights experts, including judges, academics, former UN High Commissioner for UN Rights and UN Special Procedures, members of treaty bodies, NGOs, and others. The principles are a document about human rights in the areas of sexual orientation and gender identity. They have no formal legal weight themselves, but they do gain legal weight when utilized by states and human rights mechanisms like the United Nations. The Yogyakarta principles define gender identity as, quote, each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of the body, which may involve, if freely chosen, modification of bodily appearance or function by medical, surgical, or other means, and other expressions of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerisms. Robert Wintermute was one of the original 29 signatories of the Yogyakarta Principles and has publicly admitted, quote, in a 2021 article in The Critic, the issues of access to single-sex spaces largely affect women and not men, so it was easy for the men in the group to be swept along by concern for LGBT rights and ignore this issue. 2010 marked the year of the establishment of the UN Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, known as UN Women. The UN press release announcing the creation of the UN Women contains no mention of the term sex and 13 mentions of gender within the term gender equality and gender issues. In July of 2011, the UN Human Rights Council adopted the first resolution containing the term gender identity, although the term was not defined within the resolution. Resolution 17/19 mentions the term gender identity 5 times. In December of 2011, the UN issued its first report specifically on SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity. The report issued by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights states that the committee refers to the Yogyakarta Principles on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity as a source of guidance on definitions. In July 2013, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights launched UN Free and Equal, described in their words as an unprecedented global public information campaign aimed at promoting equal rights and fair treatment of LGBTI people. The UN Free and Equal is the United Nations global campaign against homophobia and transphobia. The Free and Equal campaign defines gender identity, again, as a deeply felt and experienced sense of one's own gender. They say everyone has a gender identity, which is part of their overall identity. A person's gender identity is typically aligned with the sex assigned to them at birth. Transgender is also described as an umbrella term, which includes transsexual people, cross-dressers, sometimes referred to as transvestites, and people who identify as third gender. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, aka SDGs, were adopted by all 193 UN member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDGs are to be universally applied to every country and person by the year 2030 and are comprised of 69 targets that are broader in scope and more far-reaching than the combined goals of its predecessors, which were Agenda 21 and the Millennium Development Goals. The SDGs cover 3 dimensions referred to as economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection in the name of sustainable development. Sustainable Development Goal 5 is to, quote, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. SDG number 5 is the same goal with almost the exact same wording as Millennium Development Goal number 3, which was to, quote, promote gender equality and empower all women and girls. Notice the change in the symbols used to represent the same goal.
You'll notice that SDG 5 specifically refers to women and girls and not to females, except when it comes to the topic of genital mutilation. Why is that? Well, being a male or a female is a biological determination, meaning it refers to the chromosomes and sexual organs that one is born with. Whereas being a woman is a gender determination, which is much more fluid, complex, and subjective. The way SDG 5 is written is for all gender equality and for the most part includes anyone identifying as a woman or a girl, regardless of the biological sex they were born with.
So goal 5, gender equality, cuts across all 17 goals and explicitly includes male people, men and boys within the definitions of women and girls.
Many programs working on gender equality are not intersectional or inclusive to all women, for example, trans women. So when I speak about women and girls, I am being inclusive with the use of the term, but I think it is important to recognize that that might not always be the case in practice. And this is why we have the Leave No One Behind principle in the 2030 Agenda, which aims to put the most vulnerable first, and it's so crucial that we do that.
The voice you just heard is the same woman who was speaking before. The UN has endorsed a principle of leave no one behind as part of the 2030 Agenda. Unlike prior development goals, the Sustainable Development Goals apply to all nations. And these 2 principles combine to constitute a mandate that all states include LGBTI people within their development efforts. In 2015, the UN issued its first report on sexual orientation and gender identity. The report cites the Yogyakarta Principles definition of gender identity. once again. The position of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity was created through Human Rights Council Resolution 32/2 in June 2016 for an initial period of 3 years.
In 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council created a mandate of the independent expert for protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, the ICFS. Since then, a lot of important and groundbreaking work has been done. The goals of the independent expert's mandate are to research, examine, and provide visibility to the violence and discrimination experienced every day by gay, lesbian, bisexual.
Victor Madrigal-Borloo was appointed as UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity in late 2017. The ICFS mandate was renewed for another 3 years under Resolution 41/18 in June 2019. A 2019 ICFS report endorsed recommendations from the UN High Commissioners for Human Rights, which advised that the process of legal recognition of gender identity should be, quote, based on self-determination, simple, recognize non-binary identities that are neither man or woman, and, red flag, be made available for minors. In 2019, the UN Human Rights Council put forth Resolution 40/5, duplicitously titled Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and Girls in Sport. The resolution refers to women and girl athletes with differences of sex development, androgen sensitivity, and levels of testosterone, with the claim of the, quote, right to equality and non-discrimination and full respect of bodily autonomy and integrity. Resolution 40/5 recognizes that sports regulations and practices that discriminate against women and girls on the basis of race, gender, or any other ground of discrimination can lead to the exclusion of women and girls from competing as such on the basis of their physical and biological traits. Meaning that using physical and biological traits is not an objective means of classifying if a person is a woman or not, because it could lead to the discrimination of biological males who are included within the UN's understanding of women and girls. The resolution also called upon states to ensure that sporting associations and bodies implement policies and practices in accordance with international human rights norms and standards, and refrain from developing and enforcing policies and practices that force, coerce, or otherwise pressure women and girl athletes into undergoing unnecessary, humiliating, and harmful medical procedures in order to participate in women's events and competitive sports, and to repeal rules, policies, and practices that negate their rights to bodily integrity and autonomy. The very terms women and girls are meant to be understood to include males with penises and testes, which are referred to as, quote, differences of sex development. According to a 2019 ICFS report, bodily autonomy and integrity, quote, affect particularly intersex and trans persons. And the definition of bodily autonomy and integrity is of fundamental importance to trans persons, end quote. The report goes on to say that it is every state's duty to establish no invasive preconditions to legally recognize a person's gender identity by way of self-determination, also known as self-ID. In 2020, the government of Pakistan has become the first country in the world to include a man legally recognized as a, quote, transgender woman within a delegation sent to the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, held in Geneva. The man's name is Aisha Mughal, who works with the Ministry of Human Rights in Pakistan. Another video, this time from a UN women expert.
So let me start with saying that trans women experience violence 4 times more likely than cisgender people.
So in 2021, during a campaign called 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, UN Women expert and policy and program analyst Miriam Modalal answered the question, why do people think trans women and cis women don't deserve the same protections and rights? The answer began by describing women with the qualifier of cisgender, claiming that so-called transgender women experience violence at a rate 4 times higher than that of, quote, cisgender women. Okay, I'm going to go into a little bit of a report back from the UN on March 16, 2022, a nonpartisan international group made up of individual women and women's organizations dedicated to defending the sex-based rights of women and girls gathered on the occasion of the UN's 66th session on the Commission on the Status of Women to protest the UN's erasure of sex-specific language and protections for female people, women, and girls. The event was organized and produced by myself with vital support from Amy Souza. I want to give a thank you to all of the women warriors who supported with their attendance and otherwise: Beth Stelzer, Amanda Stuhlman, Isabella Malbin, Jessica Gonzalez, Jeanette Cooper, Jennifer De La Sega, Joy Gray, Gina Hoke, Jenna DeQuarto, Jen Ziggin, Amy Crete, Arlene, and our special guest all the way from the UK, Kelly J. Keane. The women registered a voice of non-consent for UN policies, resolutions, and campaigns that include the concept of gender identity into the definition of sex, thereby eliminating the possibility of identifying females as a biologically distinct group from males and diminishing sex-based protections for the most vulnerable women and girls around the world.
The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development promises to make human rights real for everyone, everywhere. It has 17 goals and gender equality cuts across all of them.
Women say no! Women say no! Erasure of females in the name of gender identity is being perpetrated on all levels, being bankrolled and institutionalized by supranational governing bodies like the United Nations via Agenda 2030 and the Sustainability Goals. US to UK, women say no way!
The UN is not fit for purpose when it comes to defending the rights.
Hold the line! Hold the line!
We're here today to stand for all the women of the world engaged in struggle against the trans agenda. The American Global Respect Act, which I just affectionately call the Anti-Phony Barker Act, seeks to eliminate international solidarity bills, organizing effort by the women of the world.
Males who identify as women are replacing us in sports, scholarships, public office, the boardroom, you name it. They are forcing themselves into our formerly private, sex-separated spaces. If we do not stop playing nice and start getting real soon, we will find ourselves in a position we are no longer legally or socially allowed to even mount a resistance.
The United Nations encompasses over 15 global agencies, which include the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank Group, and the World Health Organization.
The attack on our female sex-based rights in the name of gender identity, LGBT equality, and trans rights must be understood as part of a strategic, orchestrated campaign financed and managed by the world's most powerful institutions.
Women say no to our dehumanization and erasure. We will not be silent.
Nothing will stop us from protecting children from the psychological and physical harms of the lie that is gender identity.
While working at an LGBT nonprofit, I was paid in part by New York State to indoctrinate public school children with gender identity and transgender ideology. I have since become a whistleblower, working to document, expose, and publicly speak out about the attack on children being coordinated through the collusion of the state, corporate, and private sectors who use seemingly benevolent nonprofit organizations to push propaganda and target children through the public school system.
We have come together to say enough.
Enough!
Keep your puberty blockers out of the arms of children they cannot consent. Keep your wrong sex hormones out of the bodies of children they cannot consent. Keep your experimental medicine away from children. They cannot consent.
Children cannot consent. Children cannot consent.
So 20 days after this first ever protest for a women's demonstration against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Human Rights YouTube uploaded a video titled UN Free and Equal, Stand in Solidarity with All Women. The video, published April 5th, again, 20 days after our protest, asks, quote, "What does it mean to be a woman?" before going on to state, quote, "I am a woman and I am trans. Simply by existing as I am taking a stand against prejudice and discrimination that I am faced with every day. All LGBTIQ plus women are women with our own distinct identities and struggles, but united in our common fight for justice and equality." The video ends by saying, "What does it mean to be a woman? No one gets to decide for us." In July 2022, the World Health Organization announced that sex shall no longer be limited to male or female. In a statement, the WHO announced they would be updating their widely used gender mainstreaming manual. The World Health Organization claims that they will be, quote, "going beyond non-binary approaches to gender and health to recognize gender and sexual diversity, or the concepts that gender identity exists on a continuum and that sex is not limited to male or female." On December 16th, 2022, the Twitter account for the UN Special Procedures tweeted, quote, "UNIESOGI expert Victor Madrigal urges Scottish government to complete its deliberations and adopt the Gender Recognition Reform Bill." A photo shared with the tweet and attributed to Madrigal says, in reference to men, quote, "Trans women are among the most vilified, disenfranchised, stigmatized people on this planet." On December 22nd, 2022, the Scottish government passed the GRA bill, which is a plan to allow anyone over the age of 16 born or living in Scotland to change their sex in law in as little as 6 months and without the need for diagnosis or medical intervention. Medical evidence. The Scottish government is now putting pressure on the UK government to recognize the legal status of Scottish self-ID across the whole of the UK. Little clip of us in front of the United Nations.
Defend women and girls! Defend women and girls! United Nations, free your future generations! Defend women and girls! Defend women and girls! Defend women and girls! We are adult, human females, and we won't back down! Defend women and girls! Defend women and girls!
In conclusion, the United Nations Sustainability Goals are presented to us as utopian ideals that will save the world. In reality, the UN and their many collaborators are utilizing existing corporate and financial power structures to fuel the erasure of the sex-based rights and realities of females worldwide under the cover of LGBT inclusion, while simultaneously investing in biopharmaceutical and reproductive technologies that will usurp female reproductive autonomy and sovereignty. We will never comply with the lies of transgender ideology. Men are not women. Men will never become women. Join me in saying no to the spread of gender identity laws and policies that erase sex-based protections of females, and saying yes to the call for courage to stand up in the unapologetic defense of women and girls everywhere. We will hold the line for humanity. We will not allow the future they want to build to come to pass, and we will only grow in our understanding and in our numbers. Women will not comply. Women do not consent, and we are just getting started. building our global resistance, just as they are building a globalized agenda against us. We women are uniting across country, around the world, to raise our voices and speak out. So thank you to WDI for holding these webinars so that we can continue to connect, come together, organize, strengthen our analysis and our voices. Thank you very much.